They say there was a year when the sun forgot to rise. The dawns came pale, like smoke stretched across the sky. Midday felt like twilight, and twilight felt like the end of the world. The air was colder. Crops withered before they even bloomed. Famine walked through villages like a silent visitor. Across the seas, in lands that had never spoken to one another, people wrote the same words. The sun is dim. The light is gone. For 18 months, the world lived beneath a shadow no one could explain. This is the story of that darkness, of kings and peasants, monks and wanderers, and of how the earth itself seemed to turn against mankind. This is the year 536, the darkest year in recorded history. It began with the light, or rather, the lack of it. In the spring of 536, people across the Byzantine Empire woke to skies the color of lead. The great city of Constantinople stirred to an eerie dawn. The markets, usually bright with noise, opened in a half shadow. Candle makers were the first to notice. Their sales doubled overnight. Noon had become a kind of twilight. In the monasteries, scribes dipped their quills and wrote of a sun without brightness. From the coasts of Ireland to the far kingdoms of China, the same wonder and fear spread. Farmers looked up and saw the sun, a dull red disk behind thin gray curtains. It gave no warmth. Birds flew lower, confused by the strange dimness. The sea lost its color. Shadows faded. Weeks passed, and the light never returned. People whispered that perhaps this was a sign, the beginning of the end. Priests filled the churches. Incense burned thicker. Prayers grew louder, but the sky remained unmoved. In the mountains of Europe, shepherds described flakes of ash falling from nowhere, soft as snow, yet stinging to the skin. They brushed it from their cloaks, from their goat's fur, and looked upward. No fire, no smoke, only gray. In the east, Chinese court scholars recorded that the sun shone faintly, like the moon, for almost a year. The emperor's astronomers debated omens and offered sacrifices. In northern lands, Norse skalds would later tell of the Fimbul winter, the long winter before the world's end. Yet none could know that they were all witnessing the same thing. A veil stretched over the entire planet. As the months dragged on, the air grew colder. Summer crops failed. Leaves yellowed and fell before midsummer. Livestock thinned. Milk soured faster. In Constantinople, chroniclers noted that the sky was dark for 18 months. They wrote of frost in August and snow in September. The Emperor Justinian, already burdened by wars and rebuilding the empire, ordered prayers and processions through the streets. Gold icons were carried, chants echoed against marble walls. Yet the heavens gave no answer. Night and day blurred into the same pale gloom. For ordinary people, life became a test of endurance. Bakers reduced their loaves. Fishermen caught less each week. The Nile's floods came late and strange, confusing the Egyptian farmers who relied on their rhythm. In the hills of Britain, the monks of Bangor recorded that the bread was black and bitter. In Ireland, annals tell of failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Hunger gnawed quietly, and still the sun hid its face. Fear began to change shape, from awe into suspicion. In some villages, people blamed sin, in others, witchcraft. Someone angered the heavens, they said. Men accused neighbors, priests blamed heretics, rulers blamed the poor. But none of them were right. The culprit was not in the heavens they prayed to, nor in the hearts they cursed. It was beneath their feet, deep within the earth, where fire sleeps. Pause. They did not know it yet, but far to the north, in the shadowed lands of ice and stone, the mountain gods had awakened, and the smoke of their anger would circle the world. When the gray skies refused to lift, the earth itself began to change. The warmth that once rose from the soil vanished. Mornings were sharp, the ground stiff with frost even in midsummer. Rivers slowed to a crawl, thin ice forming along their edges. People waited for the thaw that never came. Seeds that should have sprouted in days lay motionless beneath the cold mud. Farmers dug their fingers into the earth and found only rot. In the highlands of Britain, the mist hung so long that shepherds lost track of the seasons. In Ireland, the annalists wrote, "A failure of bread from the year 536 until 539. 3 years of hunger." In the north, families boiled bark and moss into bitter soup. In the south, the great granaries of the empire emptied grain by the handful. The price of a loaf doubled, then tripled. Gold lost meaning when there was nothing left to buy. On the eastern steppes, herders drove their animals farther and farther in search of grass that no longer grew. Horses starved on their feet. Cattle fell in the mud, ribs sharp as blades. By winter's second breath, smoke rose from villages that once sang with harvest. It wasn't the smoke of celebration. It was the smoke of burning furniture, of people trying to keep warm. Mothers wrapped infants in straw. Fathers tore apart doors to feed their fires. And still the cold deepened. In Constantinople, the imperial gardens wilted. Fountains froze in the night. Emperor Justinian's advisors measured the dwindling stores. "We have enough," they said. But the emperor knew that hunger always travels faster than ships. Ships that once carried silk and spice now carried grain. Grain meant for soldiers, now feeding the starving. The empire's edges began to crack, not from war, but from want. In Egypt, priests pleaded to the Nile, but its flood came low and late. Silt turned sour. Crops bent under frost they had never known. For the first time in memory, the great river failed to provide. Far away in the mountains of China, a scholar recorded that snow fell like ash in summer. He noted that people died by the thousands, and that the emperor decreed mass burials so the living would not choke on the sight of the dead. The scholar wrote that the sun looked like a lantern behind silk, its warmth stolen. He did not know that others, thousands of miles away, were writing the same words. Across continents, humanity spoke one language, the language of cold and hunger. As the seasons blurred, animals disappeared. Fish migrated to warmer seas. Birds lost direction and fell from the sky. Silence spread through forests where once there had been the hum of life. In northern monasteries, monks described a pale fog that turned the world to iron. They fasted, prayed, and worked the soil with numb hands, believing penance would bring back the light. In the cities, beggars froze against the marble walls of temples. No one had enough to give. Death came quietly, not in battle, but in breath that grew thin, in children who went to sleep and did not wake. And yet, even in the darkest corners, people adapted. Fishermen carved new nets, hoping to catch whatever the cold seas spared. Potters fired thicker jars to keep food from spoiling. Mothers told stories by firelight to keep their children's minds away from hunger. When you live through a darkness that seems endless, survival itself becomes a prayer. Still, some nights, even prayers froze before they could rise. By the second year, famine no longer shocked anyone. It was part of the calendar. Families marked time not by months, but by who had died since last snow. Rumors spread of lands untouched by the cold, rich valleys beyond the mountains, islands where the sun still shone. Entire villages left in search of them, walking into white horizons and never returning. Those who remained learned not to hope for warmth. They hoped only that tomorrow would not be worse. In the halls of the powerful, astrologers argued, priests performed rites, and kings demanded answers. But the heavens stayed dim and silent. The earth gave none either. The clouds remained heavy and gray, sealing the world inside its own breath. Then, one day, after nearly 2 years, the gray began to thin. A faint circle of gold appeared on the horizon. People gathered and stared. Some wept. Others feared it was another trick. The sun returned, weak, pale, uncertain, but it was light, and light meant life. Yet the world it shone upon was no longer the same. Kingdoms had emptied, trade routes had died, faith itself had cracked. Those who survived carried a question they could not answer. What had we done to anger the sky? They would never know, not then. But centuries later, the earth would reveal the truth, frozen deep beneath ice and ash. When crops failed and winter stretched its fingers farther than any living memory, the world's great machines began to creak. Roads that once carried amber and silk fell quiet. Ports that had hummed with trade stood nearly empty, their ropes slack and their warehouses half full. The consequences did not arrive as a single thunderbolt. They arrived as 1,000 small collapses, one after another, until entire kingdoms looked like something a hand had drawn and then left to fade. In Constantinople, the city's markets slowed to a hollow bustle. Ships still returned from the Black Sea, but their holds were lighter. Taxes, once manageable, became impossible. Soldiers went unpaid. A ruler who could once command banners and grain suddenly found his table bare. Emperors have always feared two things: swords and scarcity. Scarcity is quieter, but more dangerous. It makes friends into competitors and neighbors into strangers. Soldiers who had fed on grain from distant fields now turned to pillage. A border that had been stable for decades loosened like a tied rope under strain. In the West, towns that depended on trade felt the pinch in the bones. Merchants who once sailed from Alexandria to Ravenna found fewer customers, fewer coins. Workshops closed. Skilled hands turned to other work, or to nothing at all. Apprentices left their masters and walked toward any place that promised bread. When families move out of hunger, order follows them. A village emptied, and suddenly the castle was harder to defend, the granary harder to refill. Lords who had relied on predictable harvests discovered how small their power could be when the land no longer obliged them. And then the pestilence arrived. Not as a story spread by rumor, but as a slow, merciless visitor. The fever that would later bear the name Justinian found fertile ground in a world already weakened by cold and hunger. Soldiers returning from campaigns carried more than news. They brought microbes stowed on boots and in grain sacks. In crowded cities, where people huddled close for warmth, the sickness spread quickly. Entire households vanished in the space of a week. A mother might tuck a child into bed and leave the hut for water. When she returned, both the bed and the child were gone. The official lists, bureaucrats alphabetizing death, began to grow into frightening columns. Monasteries, which had once offered refuge and food, found themselves overwhelmed by the grieving and the sick. The loss was not only of bodies, but of memory and skill. The coopers, the potters, the scribes who kept accounts, when they died, knowledge left with them. Roads fell into disrepair because there were no hands to mend them. Records rotted unread. Seeds that had been selected over many years were lost when a family line failed. In every small way, the infrastructure of civilization unstrung itself. Traders altered routes. Caravans that had once taken months now turned back when the passing months offered nothing to buy. Cities that had prospered as crossroads faded into the dust of maps. In some regions, whole stretches of land were abandoned. Fields that had been tended for generations lay fallow, and the wild breathed back in where men had once worked. Kings and emperors tried to respond. Edicts were issued: food to the poor, price controls, tax breaks, emergency grain shipments. But bureaucracy has its limits. Ships could not cross frozen seas, and granaries were not miraculous. Even when rulers poured money into relief, the money bought less and less. The faith people once placed in crowns and councils began to fray. In places where authority remained strong, it often hardened into harshness. Desperate times breed harsh laws. Some leaders resorted to strict requisitions, taking grain from farmers to feed cities. Others turned suspicion inward, accusing minorities, persecuting foreigners, blaming outsiders for misfortunes that no one could control. Old resentments found new purchase. Out of that fear came migrations. Families who had tilled the same soil for generations gathered what little they could and moved. They walked toward rumored valleys of plenty, toward distant shores they had heard described in traders' tales. Many never found those promised lands. Many perished along the way. But some arrived, bringing with them new customs, new language fragments, and new stories of suffering. The map of peoples shifted slowly, permanently, and where societies faltered, new ones sometimes sprouted from the ruins. A village abandoned in the north might be recolonized a generation later by a different group, who found the old wells and the old walls useful, and who blended their ways with what remained. Civilizations are remarkably resilient. They break, they gather, and after a time they make something new from the bones of the old. The economic ripples reached also the shores of the Indian Ocean and the far markets of China. Silk that had once changed hands many times reached fewer ports. The spice routes shivered. In the East, too, harvests failed and governments worried. People kept their eyes on the sky and the water, and all watched the same faint, flawed sun. Perhaps the most tragic consequence was psychological. People who once believed in a stable order, that seasons come, that harvests follow planting, began to doubt. Faith, where it existed, bent under the strain. Communities that had found comfort in ritual now questioned whether ritual offered any protection at all, and where people lost faith in old guarantees, fear filled the void. Fear changes the stories a people tells itself. It alters the promises parents make to children. In the aftermath, historians would later mark this moment as a hinge. Kingdoms that had been stable for generations found their borders redrawn, not solely by sword, but by hunger and disease. The political map of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East changed in quiet, human ways. Fields turned to pastures or to brush. Small towns faded. Power consolidated in new centers that could better manage scarcity. Yet even as the old world bent, people adapted. New trade paths opened to supply the hungry. Artisans taught new skills to survive in altered economies. Local leaders who were practical rather than proud gained the trust of their people. Where central authority failed, local ties became more important. Small communities that could share what they had sometimes fared better than great cities that could not. The collapse was not total, it was patchwork. Some places brightened within a generation, others took centuries to recover. The years after the gray sky would be defined by migrations and mixtures, by the slow reshaping of culture and language and law. The map that we inherit now, strange borders, odd place names, is in part the geography of those movements. And still, for those who lived through it, the memory remained sharp. They told it to their children, how the bread tasted and how the sky looked, the heavy smell of ash that had nothing to do with fire, only with the way the world had turned itself inside out. These were the small truths that survived official histories. The taste of hunger, the cold on a child's cheek, the way a father's hands shook when he could no longer provide. In the long view, kingdoms fell and rose. But the people, the ordinary people, carried the story forward. Their quiet endurance stitched the next age together. Centuries later, when the legends had cooled and the chronicles had faded, the earth itself finally spoke. Deep within the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drilled for answers. Tubes of frozen time pulled from the planet's lungs. Layer after layer, each year sealed in white. And then a scar, a black line of sulfur and ash. Another and another. The signatures of violence. Volcanoes. Not one, but many. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, mountains had erupted so fiercely that they tore open the sky. The ancient witnesses had seen the veil of smoke, but they could never have imagined its reach. Particles so fine they floated for months, riding winds from pole to pole, scattering sunlight like dust on a mirror. The world did not lose its sun. It lost its clarity. Light still arrived, but it was broken, shattered into gray. In modern labs, scientists measured those traces of sulfur and calcium in the ice, and the numbers told a story no scribe could have written. A massive eruption in 536, another in 540, possibly a third a few years later. Evidence points toward a volcano in Iceland, or perhaps Alaska, a blast so colossal it ejected millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere. Some researchers name Ilopango in El Salvador. Others suspect a cluster of northern vents. The exact mountain remains a ghost, but the effect is clear: a global volcanic winter. The temperature dropped by as much as 2 degrees worldwide, a small number on paper, but enough to collapse harvests from Europe to China. It was the coldest decade of the last 2,000 years. The ash cloud turned sunsets to blood. Even today, tree rings show stunted growth. Dust from that time still rests in glacial layers. The people of the 6th century had searched for meaning in omens and sins. They could not know that their fate had been decided by stones and fire hidden beneath ice and sea. Volcanic eruptions have a pattern. They bring darkness, then hunger, then plague. The cold weakens bodies, bodies invite disease, and trade routes spread it. Historians now trace the Justinian Plague, one of history's deadliest, to the years immediately after the 536 eruptions. It was as if the earth had opened its veins, and from them flowed darkness, cold, and death. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, knowledge survived. Monks copied books by candlelight. Scholars in the Islamic world would later gather Greek texts and preserve them. Seeds of recovery hid in the ruins. Every disaster plants something, a lesson, a shift in the world's balance. The 536 event did not end civilization. It reset it. The sky cleared slowly as dust fell back to earth. Rains returned, acidic at first, then cleaner. The sun grew bolder. For those who had survived, the world must have looked new. The colors too bright, the light almost painful. But they had learned what fragility meant. They had seen the edge of extinction and stepped back. From the ash, civilization took a new shape. The next centuries would see the rise of new kingdoms, new religions, new ideas. The darkness had passed, but its memory would linger. The year 536 faded into whispered memory. Children born in the gray years grew up telling stories of a sun that slept and a sky that wept. They called it the years without summer, the time of ash. But the human spirit is a stubborn flame. Even when light fails, it keeps its shape in the dark. In Europe, fields were cleared again. New villages rose on old foundations. In Asia, dynasties reclaimed order and built temples to the sky that had once betrayed them. Trade routes awoke slowly, weaving goods and stories from continent to continent. What had collapsed became the soil of something different. History's seasons turn not just by time, but by trial. The scientists of today look back and see a pattern: eruption, darkness, plague, renewal. The cycle is as old as the planet itself, but within that cycle lies the reason we still endure. For every catastrophe, there is adaptation. For every collapse, rebirth. The sun can sleep, but human hope does not. Imagine standing on a hill in the year 540, the first clear dawn after years of gray. Frost melts on the grass. The sky burns with a color you had forgotten existed. People are silent, not from fear, but from awe. Somewhere, a child laughs. A sound so simple, so ordinary, that it feels like a miracle. That sound, not the eruption, not the silence, is what the earth remembers. The story of 536 is not about darkness. It is about the light that followed. It reminds us that civilizations can shatter, but the instinct to rebuild is stronger than any ash cloud. When you look at the sky today, blue, calm, ordinary, remember that once the world lived without it, and still we endured. They say memory is not in the mind alone. It hides in the soil, the trees, the bones of the planet. Long after the last survivor of 536 was gone, the earth still carried that memory, written in ash, in the slow rings of trees that refused to grow. Even today, scientists studying ancient wood find those silent scars, thin, pale rings marking the years when the sun dimmed. Every tree that lived through it became a witness. In the frozen layers of the ice caps, a black dust line whispers, "We remember." Nature keeps its own archive. It is humbling to think that the air you breathe tonight may still contain a single grain of that ancient ash, carried, diluted, reborn through the endless turning of the wind. Every breath, every sunrise, is built on layers of what the earth has already survived. The year 536 was not a punishment. It was a reminder that our world is alive, restless, unpredictable, that it can change without warning, and yet, somehow, still heal itself. The ancients saw anger in the heavens. We now see chemistry and physics, but the emotion, that same awe, that same helplessness before nature, has not changed. We are the same fragile species staring up at the same sun, hoping it rises tomorrow. What was once a mystery of gods has become a message in stone. The next time the sky grows dim, we will have words for it, instruments for it. But will we have peace for it? Because knowing why something happens does not always make it easier to endure. Sometimes understanding only deepens the wonder. And yet, from that silence came the centuries that built our world, the rise of empires, languages, faiths, and inventions. Every light we see today shines brighter because we once knew the dark. The year 536 was not the last time the sun disappeared. In 1815, the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia turned skies black and made 1816 the year without a summer. Crops failed in Europe and America. Snow fell in June. People again looked to the heavens for meaning, but now science had given them names: dust, ash, climate. Today, satellites watch every plume, every cloud, every tremor beneath the ocean floor. But even with all our technology, the lesson of 536 remains. The earth can still change faster than we can respond. A single volcanic chain, a shift in the Pacific Ring of Fire, or an asteroid impact could dim our skies again. Humanity has the knowledge, but does it have the patience, the unity, the faith to survive such darkness again? History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The whispers of 536 echo in every modern crisis. In our hunger for progress, in our blindness to nature's quiet warnings, we build higher, faster, stronger. And yet, one thin veil of ash could remind us how small we still are. But if the past taught us anything, it is this: the light always returns. The same way the people of 536 looked up at the first dawn and saw the sun reborn, we too will always find our way back to warmth. This was Quiet Realms, stories that live in silence and survive the dark.